All right, so welcome to a pumpkin and squash growing primer. I'm going to start off with a brief introduction to who I am and Tourne-Sol Farm, though I recognize some of you on the call and know that you already know who I am. And then I'm going to talk about squash. So I am one of the farmers of Tourne-Sol Co-operative Farm. This is some of the team. So we started in 2005. There were 5 of us who had met studying at McGill University, McDonald campus of McGill University. And we started a worker co-op that was also a farmer. And over the years, we now have 9 co-op members. So 4 people have joined us in addition to the 5 original people. And so here we probably have 3/4 of the team. It was hard to find one time this year to get everybody on the picture. But this is who we are. And we're situated in Les Cèdres, in Quebec. But I think for everyone on this call, that's probably pretty obvious. And this is our farm, what it looked like a few years ago. It now has a bit more greenhouses on it. I mean, Les Cèdres, for those who don't know, is probably about 45 minutes west of Montreal, just west of the West Island. And we are vegetable growers, and we deliver vegetables, or we have 500 families pick up vegetables from us every week, either at our farm or at one of our 2 locations in the West Island, in Point Claire and in Beaconsfield. Sorry. And then we also have a seed company, and we grow seed that we sell, but we also have a network of other seed growers who grow seed for us. And then we also work with some wholesale seed companies too, to make sure that we have a full range of seed. But at least half of what we offer any one year is coming from our farm, and a lot of the rest is coming from people that we deal with directly, many who used to work for us on our farm. So today we're going to do a squash 101. And we're going to start off by talking about the 3 squash species. And this might be a way that you've never thought about squash. But as a seed person, this is the first way I think about squash. And then we'll talk about the whole diversity of squash, which is sort of maybe the way you think about it a little bit more. And we're going to link that, the species and the different varieties, together. Then we'll talk about cross-pollination, which as a seed grower is a really important thing to understand. And it's also very interesting as a gardener. And then we're going to go into some growing tips, and we're going to talk about a lot of different stuff. And usually at the end of the session, we'll have time to have some questions also. So that's what we're going to jump into. So to start off with the 3 squash species, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I am just going to show you, I'm going to show you them. So we have a pumpkin here, a squash. And this pumpkin is part of the species Cucurbita maxima. There are 3 species. And so Cucurbita maxima. I have another squash here that looks a bit different. This is like a kabocha squash, and this is Cucurbita maxima. So this is I don't know if I call this maxima. This is a pepo. This is a maxima. And the last one I'm going to show you is, or first of the lasts, is a muscata, which is the butternut here. These 3 squash, obviously, can I carry them all? Obviously look different one from the other. But then I also have here, and they're from 3 different species, but I have this one here, which is like a black futsu type, which looks very similar to this, but this is a pepo and this is a muscata. This is in the same species as the butternut squash. And then I also have a delicata here, just have them hanging around my office, and a pumpkin. These are the same species. And I don't have anything else that's the same species as this right now. And so now, as a seed saver, the species are very important to know about, because if crops are the same species, they will cross-pollinate. So if I save seeds, if I grow one of these beside one of these, and I save seeds from it, I'm going to get some crossing, and the next generation is going to look different, which is why if you have squash growing in your compost and suddenly it produces a fruit and you're like, I never grew that, I don't know what that is, it's because there's been some cross-pollination. And so, so these 2 can cross-pollinate because they're both pepos. But this and this will not cross-pollinate because they're different species. This is a muscata and this is a pepo. So if you were trying to save the seed, you can grow one of each of these, one Peppo, one Moscata, and one Maxima, and there'll be no cross-pollination. And so as a seed saver, that's often how you do it, is you grow one of each, and you grow enough seed to keep yourself for 3 years. And then next year you grow 3 different varieties of each of the species, and you can have a rotation that way. Now, so from a seed saving perspective, that's a nice first way to look at it, but it actually has a lot more impact than just on the cross-pollination. And so when you have a Peppo and you are growing this in your garden, when they are mature in September, they hit their peak sweetness and their best taste pretty close to maturity. Sometimes, depending on the frost date, you harvest a little bit earlier and you hold them a bit more and they get a bit sweeter, but usually they're at their peak in September at harvest, and over time they lose their flavor. And if you're eating one of these squash, like a delicious delicata, if you're eating this in January and February, it's just not going to taste as good as it did in September, October, early November. So these are squash that taste best earlier, and they'll still store often for a long time. Maybe not, like, depends on the variety and your conditions. They can store for a while, but their flavor just isn't as good deep in storage. Now we have a Maxima. The Maxima, so the Maxima tends to be also, so the Peppos have more of a sweet flavor. The Maxima has a really rich flavor, often very deep, and these at harvest, they usually are a little bit on the bland side. The sweetness in them, the starches haven't totally finished turning into sugars, and you need to store these for a couple weeks to a couple months for them to completely get sweet. And it depends on the variety. Often the ones that we put in the CSA baskets, we choose varieties that sweeten up quicker because we know that you want to eat them in the short term, and we don't do winter baskets, so we're aiming for that. But there's a whole, but they're usually not as sweet as like the Peppos are when at harvest. So they takes a few weeks to get into the flavor, and sometimes even a few months before you get the really complex flavors. And they tend to be fairly long storing squash. So those are the Maximas. Now the Moscatas, these ones are pretty sweet at harvest and stay sweet for a long time. And that's something that is nice about them, is that they're very reliable and consistent. And so that's kind of the 3 squash act differently. Now there are different varieties, and I'm going to look at those a little bit more in a moment, but the 3 squash behave very differently based on the species that they're in. So let us go back to the presentation, and you are welcome to ask questions throughout the presentation, preferably at this point in chat. When we get to the Q&A at the end, you can ask out loud, and I'll either answer them right away or I'll answer them later on. So you're welcome to ask questions if they come to you. So yeah, so there's 3 species of squash. So there's Cucurbita Peppo, that's the one, the pumpkins, the kind of the pie pumpkins, and well, I'll look at what they're in them and what's in them in a second. The Peppos, the Maximas, and the Moscatas. Those are the 3 species. Now, to look at the squash diversity, I'm going to kind of go through each species and show some of the stuff that's out there. So the Peppo that a lot of people know is just a pie pumpkin. So, there's one other thing I want to show before we go into these pictures. With here, another way to tell the differences of the species is the stems. So if you look at this Peppo stem, it has 5 sides. Now, if you look at a Moscata stem, it's all knobby and gnarly. So that's another way that you can tell the difference. And so if I look at a squash, and unless it's been cut down hard, I can tell what it is immediately. I usually know the speed right anyway, but you can tell by the stem. And the Moscata, so this is another Moscata, it also has 5 sides, but it's much smaller, and it has that swollen base on it. And I find it looks a little bit finer, a little bit more distinguished than the Peppo. So that's another distinction that I want to point out. I mean, it's more about identification in that case. It has less of an impact in the kitchen or in seed saving, other than knowing what the variety is. Okay, so I'm going to share those slides again, and I'm going to talk about different pepos. So pie pumpkins. So the small pie pumpkins are pepos. The smaller, normal looking jack-o'-lanterns are also pepos. That kind of looks like big ones of this. Spaghetti squash is a pepo. Delicata is a pepo. Acorn is a pepo. So a lot of very commonly found squash, but also summer squash like zucchini. These are pepos, and so are patty pans. So these will cross-pollinate with your other squash. And so if you're saving seed, that can be a problem. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So pepos have the broadest diversity of squash, and they grow fairly reliably in our climate. You can take almost any pepo and get it to do pretty well in at least zone 5 of Quebec. If you're in zone 3, so you have a more restrained range. So then there's the maximas, and so maximas, that has the big stem. And so this is a rouge vif d'étang. No, actually, that's a red curry squash. It looks a little bit the rouge vif, but the maximas involves, and I don't have any pictures of them, but the giant pumpkins that you see, like the ones that they have in the Atlantic and they carve out and then float in a boat race. Those are maxima squash. And this is a red curry squash. This is the Stella Blue, which is also another curry type squash. And then we have these buttercups. Turban squash is another that's maxima. So maxima has a lot of diversity. There are a lot of diversity that do really well in our climate, but some don't do as well in our climate. And then the muscata, we looked at the butternut already, and this is the black futsu. There are some others, but there's a lot less diversity of muscata. And a lot of them is something they call like cheese pumpkins. There's the Muscat de Provence, which you find in France. These also are muscatas, but a lot of them don't do well in our climate. They tend to have a much longer season, so you just don't see the same diversity. And what you really see is a lot of butternuts. They do pretty well, and there's a whole range of new butternuts on the market. So that's something that you see a lot of. The black futsu is one. This is one of my favorite squash, and we cannot reliably produce the seeds, which is one that why we rarely have it in our seed catalog. We just can't consistently produce the seed, but it's a really tasty one. So those are kind of different diversity of those squash, and so talk about a little bit about cross pollination. So let's see, yeah. So if you want to save your own seeds. You need to know a few things about squash. One of them is there are male and female flowers, and you need to get pollen that goes from the male to the female flowers to get cross-pollination. And the male and female flowers can be on the same plant. There was called dioecious, no, is that right? Monoecious plants, because they have different flowers, but on the same plant. And this means that because they're separate, it encourages more cross-pollination. And so it's easy for pollen from another flower to pollinate a squash. And that's why if you have a diversity of squash in your backyard, there will be cross-pollination. You need distances of 500 to 1,000 feet to reduce it to lower levels. And even at that level, at that distances, you'll still see cross-pollination. So that's a challenge on our farm. And that's why we grow barely any squash seed on our farm for our seed catalog. We have other people growing it elsewhere in Quebec who have bigger isolation distances. Because we're growing so many different squash for our baskets, we don't have that reduced isolation. And and the male and female, I don't have a picture, but if you look at them, you will see, you can tell the difference apart by the male is just a stem with a flower on it, whereas the female, you will see a mini squash behind the flower. And that's the ovary of the plant. And once it's pollinated, that's what's become the fruit. So you can tell them different, you can distinguish them. Now, one thing to know, and this gets people confused when I start talking about cross-pollination, is that if you have a zucchini and you have a pie pumpkin in your garden at the same time, and there's bees going around and they're cross-pollinating, if they cross-pollinate, you will not see it in that year. Your zucchinis will still look like zucchinis, and your pie pumpkins will still look like pie pumpkins. So you can harvest those fruit with careless abandon and not worry about cross-pollination. But if you save that seed and you grow it out the next year, you will see cross-pollination. And that's when you're going to see all kinds. You're going to see pumpkinis, and you're going to see zumpkins out of your zucchini pumpkin cross, and all kinds of things. And this will be really cool. They probably won't taste delicious because they're going to be a little bit too fibrous to be, summer squash and not store as well. But they'll be fun to look at for sure. And so the year you're growing the seed and the cross-pollination happens, you don't see the cross-pollination because what you're seeing is just the flesh that you're seeing is purely the genetics of the mother plant. You're not seeing any of the father's genes in that. Whereas the next year where you take the seed out and there's the DNA inside the seed, that's where the genes are crossed. And that's where and that's when you grow it out, you're seeing a plant from the combination of genes. So it's something really important to recognize. Now, one other thing is some people, and this is more of a complaint I get from home gardeners who have a couple of plants. Sometimes you don't see much fruit. And there can be different reasons why you don't get a lot of fruit. It could be fertility related. It could be there's not a lot of pollinators. It's really hard for me to diagnose it, especially in an email. But one thing that can encourage you to get more fruit is to do some pollination of your own. So you can go and you can take a Q-tip or a paintbrush, and you can look for a male flower and brush the pollen from the male flower, and then go brush it on the female flowers. And that you can be a giant bumblebee. It works best if you dress in yellow with black stripes, but you can get some results with just normal clothing also. And so you can do that pollination. Now, one thing to pay attention to is the flowers are only open for, or are only viable, or what's called receptive, I guess, for a period of time. And so so you want to do it in the morning, and you want to look for flowers that look fairly fresh and vibrant, not some that are dried up and kind of past. Like really, the flower opens up, there's pollination, and by that afternoon, the pollen is generally not viable, and the female flower is probably not going to be receptive anymore for pollen. So that's something that you can do to get more better pollination if that is one of the reasons you're not seeing fruit. So I'm going to jump into a few growing tips, and then we're going to have a Q&A time. So the first thing about squash is that squash needs space. If you've grown them, you've seen these spread out. And there are bush varieties and vining varieties. And the vining varieties, they can sometimes go for 30 or 40 feet wide, which can be a really great way to cover a lawn if you don't want to mow. but it does compete with everything else you have in your garden. So if you're in a smaller space, you probably want to look for bush varieties. But even like if you're doing a zucchini, which is a bush variety, it will be pretty much a bush. It's going to be pretty restrained. If you're doing a lot of other bush varieties like a delicata or an acorn, it'll still be more sprawling than a zucchini. So that's something to know, that they take space, and you probably want to give them something like 3 to 5 feet around it before your next plant. And you can fill that space with lettuce or radishes early on and harvest them as that space is filling in. But if they are vining plants, it's possible even that distance is not enough, and they're going to just take over. And it's got to intermingle. And if you don't mind them taking over, then it's fine to have them squishing each other. But if you're trying to also get lettuces or carrots out of that same area, you might be frustrated. So that's one thing, is to pay attention to the spacing and not place them too closely. The next is you can direct seed a squash on the ground, or you can start it indoors and then plant it out. And direct seeding is generally nice in the sense that you don't have to do a lot of extra stuff. But transplanting has a few advantages, that the seed is germinated when you put it in the ground. And also, it's going to probably be ready 1 or 2 weeks. It's going to just take off. It has 1 or 2 weeks of advance over direct seeding. So it's take off quicker, and it's going to resist disease and pests a little bit, or especially pests, quicker, because it's going to get bigger quicker. And so I usually recommend transplanting your squash, but direct seeding can work. Something some people also do is they will germinate. They'll do like take a, it could be a coffee filter or a paper towel or a tea towel, and moisten it, put the seeds in it, and then put it in a warm part of your house, and check it a couple times a day, those seedlings, at least once a day, and you'll see the seeds start to germinate. And when they start to have a little root coming out, you know that seed is going to do well, and you can plant it into the ground. And that's going to be more chance of survival than if you just plant the seed straight in the ground, because the seeds, if it's too dry, if it's too cold, they're not going to germinate well, and maybe they're going to rot before they sprout. So pre-sprouting your seeds is a way to have better success. So squash are crops that like fertility. They like to have compost, especially with nitrogen in it. So it is a good idea to give them a good dose of, fish meal or shrimp meal or something like that. When you're planting it, they will respond to it. So that's just a quick one I'm throwing in on the fertilization. Squash are also heat-loving crops. Squash are originally from South America and Central America, and I guess the south of Mexico too. It's kind of, they come from that part of the world, and they evolved with that tropical heat. They can't take any frost, so if it freezes, they will die. But also, if it's cold, they're not going to grow as well. So in the spring, there's often a strong desire to get things in the ground as soon as possible. But waiting until the soil warms up, so waiting until early June to plant your squash, might give you better results than if you get them into the ground 1 week earlier, but it's a little bit colder. So for squash, it's probably worth waiting a little bit to make sure your soil is warm, and that you're past your frost date for sure. When I'm talking about my dates, since we're in Montreal, outside of Montreal, we're in a zone 5A, 5B, we will be planting our squash. A gardener should plant a squash around early June. If you're if you have still have frost at that point, wait a little bit. Now you can also protect the plants during the night at that point if it's going to freeze. And I see there's a question in the chat, but I can't see the chat. Caroline asked about chicken manure for fertility. That does great. Chicken manure is great for fertility. Yeah, so that's so one thing, if you're doing summer squash, they like zucchini or patty pans, they do love the heat too, but you could plant them a little bit earlier than you plant your main season squash, 3rd or 4th week of May, and kind of push it and potentially risk a frost. But if they take off, you'll likely have squash, like with zucchini and also the cucumbers. Pushing it a bit means you'll have those zucchini earlier, and then you could probably plant another planting a month later to extend that season. Whereas with winter squash and pumpkins, probably just wait a little bit and then get them going, and then they'll be ready in September. And the last growing tip I'm going to talk about is cucumber beetles. So you really, if you've never grown squash, this is something you're going to meet pretty quickly. And the cucumber beetles are small little beetles that are yellow with black stripes, usually occasionally spots, but usually stripes. And they will eat up your squash plants, your squash flowers, and even your squash. And they are a bane of gardeners. And they don't, let me think about that. Actually, I don't think they overwinter here. I'm actually not 100% right now. They come in, I think, on the wind, and they will find where the squash is. But actually, I'm not 100% sure about that. So maybe don't rely on that information. What I will say is, though you can maybe spray different things for cucumber beetles, the best results is a row cover. So a floating row cover, they're often kind of whitish, but they let the sunlight through, and covering your plants, plant them in the ground, cover them immediately, so it's a physical barrier against the pest. And only uncovering once they start to flower. And at that point, the plants are usually pretty big and they can outpace the cucumber beetles. And so if you have managed to control cucumber beetle pressure for a few years, you probably won't have a lot in that area. And if you don't have neighbors with a lot of squash, and so covering them early on will help you get better success later on. If you are an area that has a lot of squash plants that aren't covered, they might just jump from one squash to another once they're uncovered. But row covers are your best bet to get ahead above the to get ahead of the cucumber beetle. So, what's next? Actually, I realize I didn't update all these slides. I'm realizing right now. But what's next is, decide if you want to grow some squash and choose some squash. The next couple slides are actually about garlic, which is my last presentation I think I gave with this slide deck before I modified it. But yeah, so think about what kind of squash you want to grow, whether you want to save seed or not, and how much space you have, and then choose that squash. And if you're looking for a source of squash seeds, we do have a range of squash. These are the squash we currently have available. I know we're going to have some blue curry shortly and some acorn squash, but these ones we do have in stock, and we'll have more squash, in the coming months. And our website is ferme-tourne-sol.qc.ca. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram as @ferme-tourne-sol. And I try to give gardening workshops every month. There's not going to be one in December because just a shorter season. So there'll be something in January. It's not going to be about hot peppers. I know I gave one recently about hot peppers, but so this is going to be a different topic. We'll advertise it probably in early December, not early January, when the next one's going to be. So pay attention to our social media or our newsletters, and you'll see. And so thank you so much for talking with or for listening to me. And we have some time for questions, and you can ask them out loud if you want, though it is being recorded. And you can also just type them in, and then I'll read them. And if you don't have questions, that's okay also.
I have one.
Go for it.
Joanne here.
Hi, Joanne.
Hi. So I gather that butternut squash is it's the Moscata family.
Yeah.
But it's also a vine. It only comes in a vine? Is that correct?
They tend to be more vining squash than bush. I don't know. I think the ones that we offer are vining. I'm not sure if there are any varieties that are bush, but they are more vining. Yeah.
Okay, because the ones I had last year, I mean, the package always says you need like 3 cubic feet of garden space. And this year and last year, my squash went wild and it just took over. So I was thinking I'd like to grow butternut squash again, and it tasted really good. But to avoid it taking over my garden, I was thinking of making almost like 2 ladders out of leftover branches and wood. That are like 5 feet long and create almost like a teepee. And can I have the vine grow up that, just to give it somewhere to climb? Or
they don't have tendrils like a pea does or like a cucumber does. So you're going to have to like tie it if you wanted to do something like that. Also, the fruit can get, it can get pretty heavy. So if it's hanging there, it will fall off eventually. Some people who will do kind of trellising like that might support the fruit to do that, but you can get it a little bit more vertical, or if you have it at the back of your garden, kind of have it go on a fence, can be a way to do that. But squash does want to spread, so it will try to outmaneuver you.
Yeah, I had one grow up my hedge last year. It was the small wonder squash. I don't know if you know that one, but it was so high. It went about 12 feet high. I had to get a ladder to pick it. But do you know if Tourne-Sol sells the bush variety of butternut squash?
We don't. The one that we have is a vining variety.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Well, thank you.
I had a question.
Go for it.
Okay. Do you have any experience with diseases like mildew? I think we had. or
So-
yeah.
Yeah, powdery mildew is a fairly common one in squash, and there are some varieties that are more resistant. Sometimes you'll see it'll say does it say PMR, maybe on powdery mildew resistant at the end of the name. But it's hard to resist. I know some people will spray with milk and stuff, but it's just something that you have to expect to come eventually. And usually, if you can get your squash to a stage where it's full size, but maybe still green, even though there's powdery mildew, the fruit will manage to mature. So I see it sometimes as a blessing because I know it's going to clear out the garden and you have all these wonderful squash appearing afterwards. If you're doing zucchini or summer squash, because you're in there harvesting, sometimes you'll be the one spreading the powdery mildew, and that's a reason to replant them. Maybe you plant some in mid to end May and then plant some again in mid to end June. And on the island of Montreal, where it's a little bit warmer than we are in its tropics compared to the rest of Quebec, you can sometimes even get a third planting in like early July, but we can't reliably do that. But so for summer squash, growing again is a way to outsmart some of the diseases.
Okay.
But good luck with that.
I have a question too.
Go for it.
Basically, we have a problem with squash vine borer.
Mm-hmm.
And the zucchini seem to survive that quite okay. But I tried to grow some buttercup.
Yeah.
And that didn't work at all. So then I found out that the muscata actually doesn't get affected by the squash vine borer. So we can grow butternut squashes, but nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any suggestions about how to deal with the squash vine borer?
Pest disease management is not my strong suit. So I don't unfortunately have one. But I think finding varieties that does better is usually a good solution, but I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer than that one on the squash vine borer. And I know it's more common than it used to be. And that might be in part because of the warmer summers, but it may also, I'm not actually sure exactly why it's more common, but I think it is more common than it used to be. But yeah, I wish you good luck.
Thank you. And I have one more question, which is when you get seed from other seed growers, are they in Quebec too?
Oh, we get seed from about 4 or 5 people who are based in Quebec, and there's one person who's based in Ontario that we directly get seed from. There's 1 or 2 people in upstate New York that we also get some seed from, so still in the same bioregion. Now, one of the challenges is not all seed matures well in our climate. And so some stuff like lettuce will grow in greenhouse to be able to get good quality. We can't get good quality lettuce seed in the field, even though you could in your backyard. Just to get pounds of it, we need to be in the best situation. So we work with some seed growers out west in Oregon, and do we do any in California right now? Oregon and Washington, and then also in BC, that have climates that are drier and can get different stuff to mature. So we get some seed in from them. And then there is a few varieties that we do buy in from wholesale seed sources because we can't get them from anybody else. But it's really a small amount. But we do, the varieties that we grow, we trial them and we choose them because they're good. And so we're looking for the best varieties for people. And yeah.
I was just wondering because, I kind of figure that when they're grown in Quebec, when they're produced in Quebec, they're kind of appropriate for Quebec conditions. And so I've been kind of buying seed from Quebec seed companies, producers, like yourself, because I figured they were more locally, kind of more adjusted to the local climate. But, if you're buying seeds from QC, from BC or from Oregon, that's a very different climate, right?
Well, so there's two, that's a fantastic question. And generally, if something is selected and grown in a bioregion, it's going to adapt to that area and do better. But that's not to say that something grown somewhere else couldn't do well in this area, but it's not a given. And so that's why it's important for a seed company to trial the varieties that they're offering. And some of the big companies like a McKenzie's or stuff, they might have the same kind of seed line that they're offering to a very broad range of places, and it might not do well. But the stuff that we're doing is going to do well in Zone 4, Zone 5, throughout Quebec, Ontario, the Maritime, probably well in other parts of Canada too, because I mean, sometimes they're colder, but they're usually not as wet as we are, so they can do well. But in terms of what we grow, like all the tomatoes, peppers, eggplants that we have in our catalog, they come almost all from our farm, a few from other growers close by. All the squash comes from around. Most of the beans and peas come from us, or the people grow for us. Sometimes we need extra because people use a lot of bean and pea seeds, and so like if we can't supply enough, we'll buy some in. But we grow a ridiculous amount of bean and pea seeds. The things that we have a real hard time with are carrots. Is one that we cannot consistently grow them here. The only seed grower that I know that has really good success with carrots in Quebec is Patrice Fortier from Société des Plantes de Kamouraska. But the carrots he grows are more heirloom varieties that are not super sweet, and they may sometimes their case were more like for feeding to horses and stuff. Some of them are sweeter, but they're not the really sweet orange ones that we're looking for. So that's something that we're always that we buy in from growers in a better climate for that. Beets and chard is hit or miss for us. So it's kind of the carrot family and the beet and chard family that are the trickiest for us. There's a few flowers too that are also tricky, but most of the rest we're growing directly ourselves. I would say, so 50% probably comes from us, 30 to 35% of the seed we offer comes from our network of contract growers. And then, or maybe I would say about 25% comes from close growers. And then another 10% is from people that we know directly. And there's probably 10 or 15% that we're getting from wholesale supply that we would always prefer to get directly from a grower. But if we know people want those seeds and they don't want to buy from like 100 little places, they like to kind of narrow and buy from 2 or 3 different places. So we do what we can. And we're very happy to be we're very transparent about what we're doing. So if you have any questions about anything,
yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. So there's a couple questions here and I think about my last 2 questions. I'll get out of the chat. Caroline asks, where is the squash in your rotation? So squash in our rotation, the way that we do a rotation is we start with a heavy feeder and then we do a light feeder. And we also do a cover crop afterwards, but if you're in a home garden, you probably aren't going to do that. But so we'll always we'll do something like squash, and then we'll do carrots, lettuce, beets the next year. And then we'll do like broccoli or tomatoes, and then like carrots, lettuce, beets, and then squash. And because it has disease problems and also needs a lot of fertility, we tend to put it in that way. So trying to aim for 1 in 4 or 1 in 6 years of the squash. It's not as disease prone as like the tomato family or the broccoli family, but it still has some things that haunt it. Laura asks, can squash tolerate some shade? Squash does not particularly like shade. It can tolerate very light amounts, but it really is a crop that likes to have a lot of shade. And it will, likes to have a lot of sun. I got to be clear about that. And it will go hunting for sun and find the spots and grow towards that. So if you're going for shade, more shade, it's really going to be some herbs and greens that are your best bet. So I see I'm getting close to the start of the next session. So I'm going to say thank you, all of you, for great questions and for for being present. And yeah, it's fun to have you all here. And I'll see you in I guess 2 months or so with the next presentation. And happy, I remember like I used to say happy gardening. Maybe it's a little bit late for that, but enjoy your squash. Happy eating. And
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. It was very informative.
That was great.
thank you.